Hello, sisters. Lovely to be with you all today. And today we're going to discuss the work of Marija Gimbutas. Actually, we're going to discuss the erasure of the work of Marija Gimbutas. And Marija Gimbutas studied the prehistory of Eastern Europe. And she suggested that there was a pre-patriarchal society in Eastern Europe, not necessarily matriarchal, but pre-patriarchal. And for that reason, her work's been enormously important to feminists. I'm going to discuss this work with Kathleen Lowrey, and she's the one who suggested that we talk about this article. And so it's great that Kathleen can be with us at 3 o'clock in the morning. So that's terrific on her part. Now, she's an associate professor of anthropology at the University of Alberta in Edmonton in Canada. In spring 2020, she was dismissed from an administrative role at her university because students complained about her criticisms of gender identity ideology and trans activism. But she has retained her academic position thanks to the protections of tenure. Kathleen helped to establish the Canadian chapter of the Women's Declaration International in the fall of 2020. She published a book in 2020 about her research in an indigenous community in Bolivia called Shamanism and Vulnerability on the North and South American Great Plains, and is currently at work on a book about the anthropology of women, which I think is going to be jolly exciting, I must say. We'll go over to Kathleen now. And Kathleen, can you tell us why you chose this article?
All right. Well, thanks, Sheila, for the question, and thanks to the seminar for having me. I've always wanted to participate, but 3 in the morning is a bit difficult for us Western North Americans, but it's very exciting to be here today. So this is going to be a little bit end loaded, that the sort of most exciting part of the story will come towards the end of the conversation. So I guess I'm first just going to say why, answer Sheila's question about why I picked this article. And a big reason for which I picked this article is, and we were talking about this before the seminar began, is I was kind of raised in exactly the anthropological tradition that Spretnak in this article really criticizes. So the kind of anthropological tradition that was very dismissive of Marija Gimbutas's work and the sort of whole body of in some ways academic and in some ways outside the academy thought about the human past that it pertained to. So I got my PhD at the University of Chicago in 2003. So most of my training was in the late 90s. And I think in many ways the training there was excellent, but it was hostile, I would say, kind of fairly hostile to feminism. Of course, not in an explicit way. They weren't conservatives who said feminism is terrible, but there's something about feminism that you just got the feeling it was a bit gauche. Like if you had to bring it up, it was a bit of a gauche topic. And I can't imagine anything that would have been more stigmatized than if you had said you were sort of a serious adherent of goddess spirituality, or you really thought, matriarchy was cool. Any of those things. I mean, I think you could have said you were like a Nazi and you would have had more friends than if you said you were into goddess feminism. That direction of feminism, which I think if you trace back, there are various kinds of splits that happen in sort of 1970s feminism, but this sort of search for kind of a women's spirituality, I think, really ended up outside the academy. And so the kind of feminism that stayed inside the academy viewed that with kind of utter disdain, and which I shared. Like I was like, okay, this is the way things are. So some of you may know there's a really famous quote from an essay published in the 1980s by a feminist anthropologist, very successful feminist anthropologist, Donna Haraway. And the last line of the essay is, "I'd rather be a cyborg than a goddess." And I think the way I read it at the time was, oh, you know, you want to be a modern feminist who is sort of into science and technology and isn't afraid of those things. I think I didn't, because I didn't know about this history. I didn't realize how much that was a kind of skewering of the whole idea of goddess anything. And of course, that line reads really differently now. I'd rather be a cyborg than a goddess, now that transhumanism is kind of roaring into everyday life. But at the time, I thought it was great, right? I was like, yeah, I want to be a cyborg rather than a goddess. You know, I don't want to be one of those, a thing that I had been taught to think of with disdain. I don't want to be one of those podgy biological essentialists, middle-aged ladies who are like a little bit too excited about motherhood. They're ludicrous, and you got, in the academy, you got so much praise if you had to mention feminism, to really be sure that you were on the side of kind of the cyborg feminism of somebody like Donna Haraway. So it was much later, I would say less than a decade ago, that it you know, slowly crawled across my brain that maybe there was something odd or suspect about this. That of course, I was a podgy middle-aged mom myself by then, so this would change my perspective. But you really, I mean, I think this happens to many of us. You just live a little longer, and you really notice that it's men in particular who are quite excited about, like, goddess, matriarchy, it's all ridiculous. And you also notice that Donna Haraway, there's another very famous anthropologist, Marilyn Strathern, who are kind of the most famous feminists in anthropology, but a tremendous amount of their work has been really about repudiating radical feminism. And this is something I know that Sheila will talk about. And I would also say that teaching sort of helped with this process, because it's really true, and I'm sure many of you know this, that you see literatures differently when you teach them than when you read them. And one of the things that, and again, this was like a realization that crawled across my brain, and then I read and found out many people, this had occurred to many other people, but as soon as you sort of organize literature chronologically, you notice that it's when we hit feminism that suddenly, in discipline after discipline, they say, oh, you know what? We don't like master narratives. We don't like grand explanatory frameworks. Like, big theory is not cool. Nobody should do big theory anymore. That's very old fashioned. We're not going to do that kind of thing anymore. And then, you know, you think, oh, it's interesting that, like, when it was Marxism, it was fine that Marxism came out of Europe, was written by a white guy, was ethnocentric, Marxism was okay. When structuralism came along, it was okay that structuralism was like invented by a white guy, came out of Europe. It was very, you know, this grand, Marxism was like a theory of everything. Structuralism was a theory of everything. Theories of everything were fine. And then you get to feminism, it's grand explanatory theory, and suddenly can't have grand explanatory theories. And the fact that it comes mostly out of the Western tradition, it's not allowed, right? Suddenly grand theories are not allowed. So the other reason I chose this article is, you know, I now know Charlene Spretnak, and I think she's a wonderful writer. This article really was one of the articles that blew my mind, because when I started to have these kinds of thoughts, and this was sort of chronologically simultaneous to when I had really been one of those, like, trans women or women, it's the next gay and lesbian rights. When I was working on an article, I've written about this elsewhere, but I was working on an article, and I thought, well, I should probably just read, like, they talk these kind of TERFs, these rad femmes who are not nice about trans people, and they're grumpy, and I should probably read a little. I'll finish in a week, right? I'll read about it, and I'll figure out what it is they think, and then I can just put it in my literature review. And then, like so many women, you know, I kind of fell into this gigantic, rich, amazing literature that I really had this strong feeling that had been hidden from me. And I think once I did that, it made me think within anthropology, I wonder if that literature about what was matriarchy isn't quite the right word, but let's call it the matriarchy or the goddess literature. I wonder if it really is that bad and that stupid. And so I went and I have to say this is an uneven literature. Some of it is a bit silly, but some of it is really terrific. And this article was one of the ones that I thought, oh, these, there are some really sharp women thinking some really interesting thoughts over here. So I think, yeah, I really like Charlene Spretnak's writing. I think this article is terrific and really well documented on, and I'll talk more about Marija Gimbutas later, but how misrepresented Marija Gimbutas, this archaeologist, how misrepresented her work had been, and then how often it was kind of straw womaned and then triumphantly refuted, that they would make a really silly version and then say like, look how silly this version is. And then what they did again and again is her work was sort of plagiarized, not in the sense of her prose being stolen, but in the sense of making a straw woman, refuting that straw woman, and then saying this much more clever and subtle thing that actually was what she had said in the first place, but then reporting this as like, our clever discovery is, well, I'll talk more about that later. So yeah, and then there's a third reason, but that I wanted to talk about Gimbutas, which has to do with recent developments in the field, but I'll get to that later, because Sheila, I know, has some really interesting things to say about feminist anthropology. So Sheila, let me hand it over to you.
Thanks, Kathleen. It's just absolutely fascinating hearing from you, from a different generation who came into the university at a different time when feminism was already gone. I think I have to say it was already gone. It's interesting to hear you talk about Donna Haraway, because Donna Haraway, I never thought had anything to do with feminism at all, because I'd been part of the feminism that was in clear language, was about making the world better for women. I couldn't understand the Donna Haraway, and nor could any of the other women around me. They're going, what's this about? What the hell is this? And yet that was purported to be feminism. It was actually the sort of work that drove women away from feminism. I mean, who the hell would want to be a cyborg? Well, I think we're pretty aware now of how very, very seriously problematic that is, when we're trying desperately to hang on to the fact that women have biology and that it matters and so on. So it was very anti-feminist work, really anti-feminist. What I want to talk about is the very, very early years. I'm talking 50 years ago, when feminist anthropology appeared and how exciting it was and what it was about. And I'm not an anthropologist at all. I'd come from history. I did a history degree, but I don't think disciplines mattered at that time at all, because the scholarship that was coming out from the women who were going into universities at that time, the men had gone in the 60s. And feminists were starting to go in the 70s. And the work that they were all doing was, in very straightforward language, because it was to create a better world for women. So, it was done in sort of Lenin, what is to be done language. There was none of this obscure new forms of Latin. It was wonderful work, and it was for us all. And we all read it, and we all absolutely loved it. So I'm not in a position at all to talk about what's happened in the last 4 decades in feminist anthropology. I don't know. But I'm just going to talk about what was in that very early work. And in the very early 70s, there were 2 books, 2 anthologies that we learned our feminist anthropology from. And the first one was in 1974, and it was called Woman, Culture and Society by Michelle Zimbalist-Rosaldo and Louise Lamfair. They were the editors. And the second one was a book called Towards an Anthropology of Women in 1975, edited by Rainer Reiter. Now, these were just hugely exciting books for us, because they were answering all the big questions that we were asking in the late 60s and the early 70s. We had huge questions about the origins of the oppression of women and how it worked. At that time, of course, our language was different. We didn't talk about gender. We talked about sex. We didn't talk about equality. We talked about oppression, because, we were in a powerful revolutionary movement. And we understood that women's oppression was global. We understood it reached into every area of life. we understood that women were colonized and that the colonization seemed to us to be total. But women desperately hoped that it wasn't the case that it was total. We desperately hoped that male domination had edges, that there were periods in history or prehistory or places in the world in what were called primitive societies where male domination didn't exist. Because how could we have the hope that we'd be able to fight for women's freedom if there was no time before and there was no time outside male domination? And feminist anthropology at that time looked like the discipline that would give us the answers. Many of us hoped that there really had been Amazons, although some of us suspected there probably weren't. Amazons who challenged men, and if anybody could answer this question of whether there were Amazons, then it was the feminist anthropologists and feminist archaeologists, and often they were pretty much the same thing. Because those looking the anthropologies on the anthropology of prehistory, I guess, is kind of archaeology. Now, as the women's liberation movement grew in the early 1970s, many of the most respected writers and theorists were anthropologists, which is really interesting because that's not the case now. And this doesn't mean that they were necessarily radical feminists, as we would understand this now. Two of those scholars, whose work is in the Towards an Anthropology of Women anthology, became, in the 1980s, stars of the movement to liberate pornography and sadomasochism and oppose feminist campaigns, because it's in the 1980s that feminism splits apart. These two were Paula Webster, who promoted a pornography for women, you know, that's the way it went in the 1980s, and Gail Rubin. Now, Gail Rubin became one of the two main promoters of lesbian sadomasochism. But in the early 1970s, she was writing really good feminist anthropology, particularly a piece called The Traffic in Women, which looked at the way in which men created their domination and by exchanging women amongst themselves. And that was the very basis of the way they organized. Now, the feminist scholarship at this time, in the very early 1970s, was tremendously exciting. And in the introduction of the first anthology, Woman, Culture and Society, Rosaldo explains the excitement of the birth of feminist anthropology specifically. The introduction says that in 1971, a group of feminist postgraduate students at Stanford University in California came together to teach a course on feminist anthropology, and their work formed the basis of the discipline. It's hard now to convey the sort of excitement that was created by the birth of feminist scholarship in all the disciplines at this time, because everybody was doing it. I did a history degree and there was no mention of women in the late 1960s. There was no mention of women in anything in the late 1960s. It was the same in every discipline. I didn't come across mention of women until I did an MA in late Victorian and Edwardian social history in 71, and which covered the suffragettes as one of the revolutionary forces in the UK in the period just before the First World War. And I was fascinated. Otherwise, half the human race was absent from the account, and the way the history was created was out of the relations of male power between men and women. That was just not imagined. And indeed, to rectify that, some of us in 1983 put together a book called The Sexual Dynamics of History to show that you can't understand history at all unless you look at it from the base up, and the basis is the relations of power between men and women. So what I'm going to do now is give a couple of examples of what was exciting about that very, very early feminist anthropology from the Woman, Culture and Society anthology. And the opening essay is by Rosaldo, and she explains what she sees as the fundamental puzzle, for instance, when looking at the role of women in societies historically and cross-culturally. And she says that in all societies, the roles of women and men are distinct. Different and definitely different traits and behaviors are associated with men and women, and there are no societies in which these are randomly mixed. But whatever men do, they have status that women do not. And an example she gives is that of the wearing of face coverings among the Tuareg tribes people in North Africa. This is an Islamic tribe where women do not wear veils, and traditionally men do. However, Rosaldo explains that the men wear the veils for reasons which support their dominance, i.e. to separate themselves from the petty and messy affairs of the home and emphasize their difference from women. And she has in her chapter, and this is just to show how women were really working things out and how the cogs of their mind were going at the time, she includes in brackets that this behavior of face covering can be seen in men in the West in their habit of hiding behind newspapers on the train or at the breakfast table, which I think is just a lovely, lovely example of how this works. So whatever women do, she explains, even if it's what men do to show their dominant status in another culture, when women do it, it is a low status behavior. Now, that's a fundamentally important understanding, which only feminist anthropology, which was comparing societies and cultures, could give us. Now, another example of what was going on in that feminist anthropology at the time, which is more germane to our discussion today, is the way feminists were looking at matriarchy. And the big question of the time was whether matriarchy, when women ruled over men, ever existed. And the idea of matriarchy was attractive because it suggested that if women had ruled before, then patriarchy could be overcome and women could rule again. And feminists got their ideas from the work of Johann Backhoven, a mid-19th century Swiss anthropologist who used the mythology of many cultures to say that matriarchy was a stage that cultures in European history, prehistory, went through. And Friedrich Engels, in his book, The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State, popularized Backhoven's ideas. And they were very, very popular amongst feminists at the time. Feminists used the existence of ancient goddess figures in Eastern Europe, the so-called fertility goddesses, as evidence that matriarchy had existed and that goddesses were worshipped at that time instead of gods. I, of course, had studied history, including ancient history at university in the 60s, and I was a bit skeptical of all the stories that women were telling each other about matriarchies, about times when women had power. I was sympathetic to the arguments from feminist anthropologists that matriarchy was a myth, because some of them argued that. In fact, in the culture, Women, Culture and Society collection, there's a piece supporting matriarchy, and there's a piece saying that called The Myth of Matriarchy by Joan Bamberger. Gimbutas' work was not known at the time, and it's not mentioned in either of those early anthologies. So we're talking before Gimbutas. Joan Bamberger explains that Backhoven got his history wrong because he relied on myth. A myth was not reliable as an indication of what actually took place in prehistory. And she argues, using examples of matriarchy myths in South America, that the idea of matriarchy was an invention. It was invented, she said, by men to explain why men were in control of women and must be in control of women. The matriarchy myths explained that there was a time when women were in control of the sacred huts and the sacred instruments, and they ruled over men. But this time, the myths explain, was one of terrible chaos, such that eventually the men had to attack and destroy women's power for the benefit of everybody. They had to take back the sacred instruments and the sacred huts. And in one case, the myths say the men had to kill all the adult women in order to destroy their power and wait until girl children were grown in order to establish male rule over a new generation for the sake of everybody. Now, the point of the myths, Bamberger explains, was to justify male domination, lest any women should consider male domination unfair. And the myths showed clearly that men had to rule, but of course they had little relation to actual history. The myths had a political purpose rather than being a truthful account, she argues. And this was my understanding of matriarchy at that time, that it was a myth. I knew nothing about Gimbutas, and the anthologies don't mention her, nobody knew of her. And her first book on the topic of the social order of the sexes came out in 1974, the same year as that, at Women, Culture and Society. Now, Paula Webster, though, at that time, a good feminist anthropologist, explains in her chapter called Matriarchy, A Vision of Power, that whether or not matriarchy exists turns out to have existed. The idea of matriarchy is crucial to feminists because it, quote, pushes women and men to imagine a society that is not patriarchal, one in which women, for the first time, have power over their lives. So that's basically just a little account of the excitement of that early time and what feminist anthropology meant to us then. But now let's go into talking more about Gimbutas and this later period, for which I know nothing, and Kathleen does. So my question now for Kathleen is, first of all, can you tell us about Marija Gimbutas, where she came from, and about the trajectory of her life?
Okay. Yes, I think that was really, well, I read a lot of that beforehand, but it was really fascinating to hear about that. I mean, we kind of talked about a little bit about how there's this sort of before times of feminist scholarship, and then this after times, and the 1980s seems to be the dividing decade. But to just talk, and I know probably many people do know who Gimbutas is, but I'll just give a little bit of background about her. So the article that we're discussing today really talks about the reception of Gimbutas's work. But Gimbutas herself, she was, Marija Gimbutas was born in Lithuania in 1921. Her parents were Lithuanian nationalists, and her first training was as a Lithuanian folklorist. She completed her doctoral degree in archaeology in Germany during Nazi rule, and I'll actually return to this because this is sort of important to her story. And she and her family were admitted to the United States in the 1950s as refugees from the Soviet occupation of Lithuania. Personally, she is said to have been both an anti-Nazi and an anti-communist. When she came to the States, she acquired a research affiliation with Harvard, and she was called upon by male colleagues there to do a lot of translation work because she was multilingual. She and her husband, she and her husband came with their children, but they divorced while she was affiliated with Harvard. And apparently she felt a considerable degree of frustration while at Harvard that she was publishing a lot, she was winning grants to do archaeological digs, and yet she was sort of treated as an assistant. I mean, she not just in terms of her role, but also she was asked to do a lot of kind of, could you translate this for me? Could you, that kind of work by colleagues at Harvard. But because she did publish a lot, she was offered a professorship at UCLA in 1964, and she stayed there for the rest of her career. She was a really important bridge during the Cold War between sort of Western and kind of Iron Curtain archaeologists. And she had, she was like she had extensive networks in sort of both worlds. She's trained students who've gone on to important careers, and she maintained a lot of important research connections with Central and Eastern European scholars and sites and institutes. So once her research, especially some of the things that she was saying about women's role in what she was analyzing about what she thought looked like was the religion of what she called Old Europe, and I'll describe in a second what Old Europe is, that had a lot of female iconography in which female figurines were very important. Her research started to be sort of discovered by feminists in the 1980s, and Gimbutas, because of this, started to be viewed with quite a lot of alarm by her academic colleagues. One of her students told me that her atmosphere became spooky around this. This is a male colleague. He said it became spooky around her. And it's also the case, and I think this part of her story doesn't necessarily have anything to do with feminism. She was trained in an older archaeological tradition that in some ways was more interested in broad narration. And archaeology, particularly in the 1960s and the 1970s, was becoming much more, I wouldn't say in some ways scientific, but I also think in some ways scientistic, that it really had this kind of science anxiety and became much narrower. And so the kind of work that she was doing that really tried to imagine past worlds was incredibly out of favor. So I think that didn't help. And I would say her later work, the stuff she was doing towards the end of her life, is super interesting. She, like, one of the later works is The Language of the Goddess, and she's engaged on this project of trying to kind of decode the symbolism of figurines and ceramics that appear in the archaeological record in Europe from pretty much the Upper Paleolithic right into the Neolithic. And so she, there's repeated themes like lozenges and wavy lines, and she comes up with these ideas like the wavy lines mean water and the lozenges are like symbols of female fertility. And I mean, I'm quite sympathetic. I mean, I'm very impressed by Gimbutas' work, but this, I would say, that's not really a falsifiable hypothesis. We're never going to have sort of a Rosetta Stone that says like, oh, this is what Upper Paleolithic people were actually thinking about wavy lines. Okay, and she died of cancer in 1994, so she wasn't young, but I think it probably wasn't. I mean, it's never great for your scholarly career to die. It's not like being a rock star. You have to keep going to conferences and keep promoting your work. And so I think it didn't help that she died. Not she was 73. She wasn't young, but she was quite ill towards the end. So yeah. So Spretnak's article that I'm talking about today was written in 2011, and so long after her death, and it does a really wonderful job, I think, of showing how Gimbutas' contributions were distorted during her life and after her death. I also think it's really devastating. I think it tells the story of this in-between time, because a lot of the article talks about how certain kinds of feminist careers were built on kind of trashing various straw versions of Gimbutas. So one of the straw versions of Gimbutas was that she was a very simple-minded matriarchalist. So her vision of matriarchy was kind of an inverse of patriarchy. So women are the bosses of everything, and in this matriarchal world of old Europe, women are the bosses of everything, and there's no conflict, and it's entirely peaceful, and isn't that silly? And that is silly, and Gimbutas never said any of that she was a biological essentialist. I talked to one archaeologist, and he said, she thought all these goddess figurines in the archaeological records, she thought they were all mother figures. And I know an archaeologist who did an analysis who looked at a collection of these sorts of female figurines and categorized them. Some of them represented young women, and some of them represented middle-aged women, and some of them represented old women, according to their typology. And so this just blows Gimbutas out of the water, because Gimbutas thought they were all mothers. And it's really not what Gimbutas said. So again and again, Gimbutas is kind of set up as this punching bag that then people build their careers on saying, I'm not like her. And if you go and look at her work, Mrs. Spretnak makes this point really well, she never said things that were that simplistic. So what exactly did she say? I'm sure at this point, some of you who haven't read Gimbutas are pretty curious. We've been talking about her, and I haven't really explained. I'm not going to talk about her Language of the Goddess work, which I think the ambition of that project is really interesting. And it would be maybe nice to talk about in another context, but I'm not going to talk about that today. That I want to tell a story that kind of has a really satisfying ending. The other big theory she was known for was what was called the Kurgan Hypothesis. So Kurgan is a Russian word for a certain kind of burial. It's like a barrow burial. And Gimbutas, who had probably had read more site studies and more languages across a wider area of Eastern and Central Europe than really any of her contemporaries, her basic thesis was that what she termed Old Europe, and the reason she had to come up with her own language for terming this is she's really thinking about a very long historical time period of a much broader swath than archaeologists normally think in. She sees a kind of continuity that begins in the Upper Paleolithic. And so just to give an idea of the dates, probably all of you have seen the Venus of Willendorf, that sort of little fat, like she has big boobies, and it's the really famous sort of classic goddess figurine, right? The little round body, and she looks like she's wearing a cap or something. The famous goddess figurine that's reproduced everywhere. Like if there's a t-shirt with a goddess figurine, that's the so-called Venus of Willendorf. The Venus of Willendorf is about 25,000 years old. So very old, right? The Upper Paleolithic in Europe, it starts about 50,000 years ago. So her vision of old Europe posits continuities from about 50,000 years ago, that you have a lot of figurines that are obviously female. You also have a lot of iconography she interprets as associated with women's bodies, fertility, and she posits a kind of religion or spirituality that has to do with reproduction, fertility, and in which women played a very important role, because she's positing that there's a lot of the philosophy has to do with rebirth and regeneration and reproduction. So there's an interpretation also of certain kinds of graves that have like a long entryway, and then you find the bodies buried in these graves. So there's this long passage, and then there's this round place where they're buried, and the bodies are sometimes covered in ochre, which is red. And so one can interpret that the symbolism here is like this person is going to be reborn, right? They're being put back into the earth, they're being put back into a womb, they're covered in blood, symbolic blood in the form of ochre, and there's going to be a rebirth. So of course, we can't interview Upper Paleolithic people. We don't know what they think, but these are the kinds of ideas that she had, and she sees a real continuity from the Upper Paleolithic into the Neolithic, which starts about 12,000 years ago with the widespread adoption of settled agriculture. People are growing barley and lentils and raising pigs and goats and sheep. Now, this causes changes, of course, but she doesn't see agriculture as causing a dramatic revolution, at least initially. She actually sees that there's a lot of continuity of what she thinks of as religious beliefs. And you have this nice settled agrarian society, this settled agricultural society, and there's not a lot of evidence for intense social inequality. And importantly, there's not a lot of evidence for a lot of sexual inequality. So when you do find high status burials, you will at least as often find high status burials of women as of men. And again, a continuity of this female iconography. Okay, this dramatically changes around 6,000 years ago. Suddenly there's a proliferation of burials that are obviously much more high status, right? So society has become more hierarchical. These burials are overwhelmingly of men. So these are these kurgans, the Kurgan burials, and these burials are full of weapons, right? There's also a lot of evidence for social dislocation. So it's in some places it's called the burned horizon, because you see there's evidence of like villages being burned down. Okay, so archaeologists, this isn't like Gimbutas' theory, archaeologists all agree about this. And Gimbutas argued that this change was the result of a violent invasion by mostly male warriors from the steppe region of present-day Russia. She wasn't actually the first archaeologist to propose this. This was actually a kind of generally accepted idea for most of the first part of the 20th century. One of the things that kind of put it in bad odor is the Nazis loved this idea that for them, this was their blonde beast from the steppes. This was like the original Aryan that like charges in on their horses and like da-da-da-da, and they dominate Europe with their racial superiority. And some of the criticism of Gimbutas was like, oh, the reason she thinks that this is an invasion is because like she's secretly a Nazi. Although this doesn't make sense, because she doesn't view this the way the Nazis viewed it. She doesn't view it in a celebratory way. She actually thinks it's like this incredible prehistoric tragedy. The other thing that was said about Gimbutas is the reason she thinks that this violent invasion came from the steppes is she's an anti-communist and she's like a Lithuanian who hates Russia. So of course Russians would be the bad guys. Yeah, okay, so that's Gimbutas' Kurgan hypothesis. There's an invasion from the steppes. It's a mostly male invasion. It's very violent, and dramatically transforms European society. It destroys this previous peaceful, more or less egalitarian. She never posited that it was matriarchal in the sense of like women were the bosses, there was no conflict, but it was generally more peaceful, generally more sexually egalitarian society. The opposing theory, which became popular in the 1970s, was that what you saw, that everyone agreed there's definitely a change, like around this 5,000, 6,000 years ago, there's a change in what society looks like. But the mainstream theory after the 1970s was, this wasn't an invasion, this was kind of a change of fashion, basically. There wasn't a population change. It was just a new idea about how to run society. So people were like, so this so-called old Europe was not transformed by violence, but by the spread of a new set of ideas. So like people were like, oh, those weapons look so cool. Oh, we think we'll use horses. Now, I think in the 70s, part of the reason for this thesis becoming dominant was kind of a groovy reason, which is it didn't seem like the Nazi idea of a race coming, like a superior race coming in and dominating the local races. It said, look, people are agentive and they make choices. Although I think for us, we can really hear the resonance with the kind of the whole rhetoric of choice. Like people just choose how they're people can make different kinds of choices. So this sort of suggested, well, people didn't want to do, like, once this kind of exciting patriarchal male god, lots of weapons way of life became fashionable, people were just like, oh my God, it looks so cool, we should do that too. And that's why you see it spread across Europe, because one kind of, the idea is one village after another is like, oh, they're doing some cool stuff with like patriarchal gods and weapons, like maybe we should do some stuff with patriarchal gods and weapons. So there are some good reasons why people might have thought that, and it definitely seemed like an anti-Nazi way of thinking about the archaeological past. But making the case for this second explanation was a really viciously misogynist process. Gimbutas became the target of for the idea that what came before the change was better or gentler. It's like, that's so judgmental, like who even knows? Maybe people just like to live different ways. Sometimes they like to live in an egalitarian way, sometimes they like to live in a patriarchal way. You can't assume just because their graves are full of weapons that they were more violent than anything that had come before. These are just sort of woolly fantasies about the past. Okay, so that's where it stood in 1994 and for a long time afterward. But there's a coda, there's a really nice coda to this story, which is about 5 years ago, because of advances in genetic technology, it became possible to analyze ancient DNA. You could actually test the DNA of skeletal remains from before and after this big change, about 5,000 or 6,000 years ago, from before and after when the Kurgan burials appear. And the evidence was very clear that in the before burials, you have what's called Western European hunter-gatherer and early Neolithic DNA. In the after burials, you suddenly see a lot of Yamnaya DNA. And this Yamnaya DNA comes from exactly where Gimbutas predicted, which was the steppes of what are called the Pontic steppes towards Russia. The really fascinating part is the change isn't evenly distributed. The Y chromosome DNA, which is, only men have Y chromosomes. We're TERFs, so we know that. So the Y chromosome DNA goes from pretty much all Western hunter-gatherer and early Neolithic to pretty much all Yamnaya. What does this tell you? That this was a violent invasion in which men came, killed off the local men, and then the children born in the generations after are mostly the children of these invaders. Okay, so this is exactly what Gimbutas had said happened. And she knew the area so well, she knew the literature so well, she knew all the sites. Now, I want to be clear that this is not the story of all human history. This doesn't prove like, yes, once upon a time humans lived in a peaceful universe and then the patriarchs came and everything sucked after that. This is something that happened at one period of time in one part of the world. What I think for us, what's important for us is that this transition was violent. I think this really confirms a kind of basic feminist hunch that people don't just adopt patriarchal, domineering, weapon-heavy lifestyles like on a whim, right? Like, oh my God, it looks so cool, let's just do it. Like they don't just choose this. When you see a kind of more egalitarian way of life become a less egalitarian way of life, when you see a way of life in which women have power that is similar to the power that men have. This is really Gimbutas's argument. When you see that change to a world in which men have all the power, that people don't make that transition as a choice, which is what the kind of, it's just the transfer of kind of a style of life. That has to be imposed by violence. And I think that's, that really confirms one of it, that when we see this kind of inequality, when we see this kind of male dominance, that it does have a history. The reaction to these findings has been really telling. So some archaeologists have been really gracious about it. So somebody, Sir Colin Renfrew, who is one of Gimbutas's major antagonists for years and years and years, has been incredibly gracious about it. Like he's just said, wow, turns out, and he was kind of awful to her, but he's like, she was right. Okay, Gimbutas is confirmed. But other scholars have been really reluctant to, so David Anthony, who's an archaeologist, probably around my age, around 50, says the recent discoveries, I'm quoting, have prompted some to ask the uneasy question of whether Gimbutas was right. And he goes on to say, oh, don't worry. She's still wrong because the process was not a single event conquest as her model suggests, but instead a kind of processual migration. Of course, there's no prizes for guessing that Gimbutas never said it was a single event. I mean, it's this thing they do over and over again, which is they set up a straw version of what Gimbutas said, and then they're like, ah, that stupid thing didn't happen. In fact, this other thing happened, which is exactly the thing that she said happened. So anyway, I just think anthropology since the 1980s has been so soaked in a certain kind of almost like cognitive misogyny that younger scholars are often more misogynist in a way than older ones. And I think this pattern holds true across multiple disciplines in the social sciences and humanities, that 1970s feminism posed such a major challenge, both politically and intellectually, that discipline after discipline sort of made an about face. But I just want to end on a more general optimistic point and then hand it back over to Sheila, which is, specifically in anthropology, new advances, ancient DNA in particular, are really upending our notions of what we thought we knew about the human past, including the very deep human past of human evolution. And I would say generally anthropology is not coping well, but it's really great for feminists like us because big questions, really ambitious questions, are kind of back on the table in a way they haven't been pretty much since the 1970s. I think, Gimbutas, the sort of second look at Gimbutas, I think we're going to see it in more and more parts of anthropology. I think we're going to see it in more and more disciplines. I'm writing a book about it in anthropology, but I think we're in a moment where pretty soon we're going to be able to start opening a lot of doors that have been slammed shut. So the whole postmodern, post-structural, post-processual, anti-feminist paradigm is, in my view, really running aground. So now I want to hand the floor back to Sheila because I know she has some really interesting things to say to end on about exactly this kind of big question problem.
Thanks, Kathleen. as you were speaking, somebody, Mary Curran, was saying in the Q&A, there's a marvelous sort of goddess culture ruins in Greece and Malta and so on. And indeed, I lived in Malta as a child and was taken into catacombs when I was 9 years old, but I didn't know it was anything to do with goddess figures or fertility or anything there. But I did go back in 2018 to Malta, and we did go to the temples, the prehistoric temples, and they are truly absolutely extraordinary. They are built in the folds of a woman's body, which is absolutely extraordinary. There's no straight walls, there are no corners, and of course there's masses and masses of goddesses in their full and extraordinary form, statues there. And I remember as I was going round the temple, there were different parties being taken by guides, and one of them was saying absolutely nothing about goddesses or women and just sort of straightforward. And the other one was saying this temple is built in the form of the curves of a woman's body. And I thought, wow, that she's saying that, because it's kind of extraordinary stuff. It really is. But I don't know enough about it to say anything more about it than, my goodness, if you go there and you see that, it really opens your eyes and makes you think differently about the world. I had no idea there were all these massive buildings built in these shapes, in fact. Now, in terms of, where are we now? What I wanted to add was that I do think that certainly in the academy, big questions aren't being asked now. And of course, you explained earlier that what happened was postmodernism happened. And it said we shouldn't ask big questions. We shouldn't have a long view. We shouldn't be teleological, and so on. So we were only allowed to look at tiny, tiny little things and say, aren't they interesting? And make no connections between them at all, because as you said, it was pretty much directed to get rid of feminism, because Marxists were allowed to make connections, others were allowed to make connections. And I can only talk from where I was teaching in Melbourne at the university. It was and the feminist anthropology that was being taught there. And it tended to be about things like patterns of women's dancing in certain places in Asia. Absolutely not about any of these big questions that we've been asking. So that for creating a feminist revolution is not something that's really helpful. And I think a lot of stuff about women went into looking at women's this and women's that, but the big questions were absolutely not asked, really. I mean, what we have begun to talk about, but not gone into in any great detail, is what happened historically to women's studies, to feminist intellectual work. And of course, we've suggested that one of the things that happened was postmodernism. In 1979, I went to, in Britain, a postgraduate sociology conference, and Foucault's work was being absolutely promoted by feminists as the new feminist way of understanding the world. I was horrified. I was a radical feminist, and I stood up and shouted something in the auditorium, and then did a breakaway group, and loads of us feminists went to a different room to discuss what we saw as a disaster. A disaster. No longer was feminist theory supposed to come from women, but from men who were actually quite hostile to the ideas of women. So gradually, this postmodernism took over. There's plenty of feminism still happening in the 1980s, but by the late 1980s, by the 1990s, mostly postmodern ideas had taken over, and women's studies had become, as I said earlier, pretty much unintelligible. So, I am very pleased that you're saying you think something's changing out there. I mean, give us any other indications of hope that the big questions will be asked again, and that feminists in the academy can have any future. What do you think?
I don't know. I mean, I do think the academy has a pernicious, and I know, feminists have discussed this for a long time. Was it a mistake to go into the academy? So I don't know if I can answer that big question, but let me just go back to a smaller question that I didn't mention in anthropology. Some recent interesting work about human evolution has been asking a different question if the question, I think even a lot of feminists asked was just like, where does inequality come from, right? So where does inequality, social inequality generally, where does social inequality between the sexes come from? Is it agriculture? Is it some kind of advent of patriarchy? Which I think remains an interesting question. That's why these work like Gimbutas's that suggests, oh, there have been times when things have been more equal. But a sort of big question that some biological anthropologists are asking is an interesting question about maybe the question is not where did inequality come from, but where did sexual equality come from? Because as a primate species, we're not the most sort of sexually equal, but the role of relative sexual equality in the development of our capacities as human beings, the degree of empathy we have, the long period of childcare that we have, the cooperative childcare that we have, these kinds of questions about, maybe the interesting question is not how do we become unequal, but how has equality between the sexes made us human? Like, so maybe we should be asking the question about where did equality come from? And I think if we think in those terms, our backstory of equality is temporally much deeper than, I mean, you know, if we're thinking like, I don't know, in the European case, say like 6,000 years ago, or maybe you could go a little bit further back, that would be that the story of inequality begins. If we think of the whole human story, the long period where equality was so important to the development of our special human capacities. So that's just one example of, that's a big question, right? And I think I'm seeing in my discipline more interest in the big questions. And I think this might be something that's happening in discipline after discipline. And I think it creates a space for feminism to come back in. I mean, maybe the academy will kill us again, right? We'll come back in, but maybe, I don't know, maybe this time it'll go better.
I like the fact that you are showing some optimism here, because I'm not very hopeful about the academy yet at the moment, but then I'm no longer there, and you are there, and you are doing this wonderful work. Can I just say, in terms of the way that the academy destroyed the reputation of Gimbutas, I've got a nice little quote here from Mary Beard. A lot of you will have heard of Mary Beard, who does all the television history programs. And apparently in the article explains that in the course of reviewing a book on the role of women in Minoan culture, because the Minoan culture in Crete is supposed to be one of the less patriarchal cultures that was destroyed in this invasion and so on. She's reviewing a book on Minoan culture in 2009. And she mentions Marija Gimbutas. And what she says is, she talks about the frankly dotty ideas of matriarchal goddesses floated by Robert Graves and Marija Gimbutas. Isn't that extraordinary? I mean, she's pretty much the most famous sort of woman historian on television or anywhere right now. And she just says Marija Gimbutas is dotty, which is pretty much the most extraordinary dismissal that I've ever seen of the work of a very serious scholar at any time before, really. Yeah, and any other thoughts? Because I think we've pretty much come to the end of our discussion.
No, it's just, yeah, I've been, you know, it's an honor to have this discussion with you, because we get an arc, you know, and hopefully, I don't know, hopefully it's an arc that's bending towards justice.
Yes,
maybe.
I like the arc that you know, women of my generation are able to talk to women like you who came in after the feminism had been disappeared. I mean, that's really, really interesting. Mm-hmm. And I think something else that is good to do, we need to write that history and how it disappeared. We need to write that history. And also talk about many other women whose work has been disappeared too, which pretty much in this series we're doing, like Kate Millett, who's been pretty much disappeared, Gimbutas, and so on. Lots of other really significant feminist scholars whose work has been pretty much disappeared. And we are bringing it back. So thanks very, very, very much, Kathleen,
Okay,
for
thank you,
helping
Sheila.
us to bring this back today. That's
Okay.
absolutely terrific.
Yeah, and thanks to everyone at the seminar.
And indeed, thank you to everybody who's been listening, taking part in the chat, taking part in all of this. I think it's just marvelous that we're able to do it in this way. Thanks very much indeed, everybody. And we're going now and hope to see you again if you can manage it in your time zones next week. Okay, bye-bye for now, everybody. And I hope to see you in the breakout rooms if some of you manage to find the link in the chat and get over there. Bye for now.